All right, recording. So I finally graded the tests, at least most of them, and most were pretty good. It reminds you of how this course is graded. The labs are what, 20%. So if they are in on time, then they usually get 100. The homework is worth 20%, and if that's in on time, that usually gets 100. And so 40% of your grade should be 100. If there are things from that were due by test 1 that you didn't turn in, those things are worth up to 90. So there's plenty of points still to be had. Get stuff in. Okay, so that portion of your grade is very much under your control. Get all those points. There are 3 tests and a final. So, and the final is a longer test, although I don't know, some test 2 and test 3 will be longer. So test 2 will be in the lab and will consist of 2 parts. And same for test 3. So the tests from now on will sort of be on Tuesdays, the lab day. But there are 3 tests and the final, just as programming, the way it works is cumulative. So it will be everything sort of encompassing everything. So that means that there will be 5 sort of test grades, 3 tests, 3 regular tests, and the final counting twice. And then one of those grades, whichever is lowest, gets dropped. So if you have a bad final, then 1 copy of the final goes down, and the final just counts as a regular test, of which then there will be 4. If one of the tests is your worst grade, then it gets canceled and the final will count twice. So again, so 3 tests and the final counting twice, one of those 5 is dropped. You don't have to tell me which one. People always want to tell me, oh, I'm going to drop test 2. I put it in Excel. I have Excel tell me which one is the lowest, and I drop the lowest. So you don't need to tell me, but people feel psychological need to tell me. All right, so that's just a reminder, since I gave back a test, of where things stand grading wise. Now, next week we're off for 2 days, so yay. And there is I have to put in a midterm grade for freshmen, sophomores, new transfers, which is probably that probably covers. So I will do that. I won't drop a test grade. I don't have enough tests to drop anything. So it will be the homework I have from you, whatever I have graded, and the first test. That's what I will base a midterm grade on. So any questions? So the midterm grade means nothing. It's just an indicator of where you stand at that given instant in time. With drop tests and a very lenient late penalty, it means almost nothing, but I have to do it, so I do. If you want a more realistic, more nuanced feel for where you stand, then you can come and talk to me and we'll sit down and do more. All right. Any questions about test grades, how the final grade is calculated, anything? All right, so on Friday, we started to talk about whiles, and we started to write this program about dice. And let's continue with that. And then if we have time, we'll start timers. So there it is under Friday, under dice, if you don't have it. I do. So, okay, so what we had done was we have a button at this stage. We have two variables for dice. We are using our formula to get a pseudo-random number between 1 and 6. I'm throwing it into a text area. I'm doing a plus equal, so I'm appending it. And then we're asking if it is a snake eyes, if it was 2 1s. And there are different ways to do this. One way to do it is to add the 2 die values and get a sum, and then ask if the sum is 2. That's a possible approach. But we went for this individually, looking at the die values and combining them with a Boolean. And we looked at what I'll call the positive logic, to find out if it is snake eyes. And so then we asked if die 1 is equal to 1 and die 2 are equal to 1, then that was snake eyes. And then we wanted to invert that logic to find out when it's not snake eyes, because we want to turn this if into a while loop and keep rolling the dice until we get snake eyes. And so we wanted to know, we wanted the logic when it was not snake eyes. In a while loop, your condition is the condition under which you continue. And so we want to continue while it's not snake eyes. So in inverting, if you are taking this approach of the Boolean, and if we were inverting this logic to find out the opposite of this logic, when die 1 is equal to 1 and die 2 is equal to 1, then the opposite of that is exclamation point equal is not equal. Mm-hmm. So the equal turned into exclamation equal, and the and turns into an or. And I wasn't very lucky about rolling snake eyes, but people confirmed for me that that did indeed work. Whereas we confirmed that this did not work, that there were times when when that was not snake eye, when it wasn't snake eyes, but calling it snake eyes, I think. Or yes. So, and this is known, when you take some Boolean thing and take the opposite of it, and ands turn into ors, that has a fancy name that is known as De Morgan's theorem. Okay. So now we want to turn this if into a while. That was our goal. So let's turn this one more thing into a comment. And now what are we in? We are in, I just have one great big comment. I'm going to make a there, sorry. A while loop and what was our condition? We wanted to continue while we did not have snake eyes. That was our condition for continuing. And then we want to roll and display. All right. So while we don't have snake eyes, roll again and display it. So it should just, I should fill out my little table, and then the last one should be snake eyes if this is working. So hit the button and I get stuff. And then the last one is snake eyes. Stuff, snake eyes. This is a while. We introduced the while on Friday because we were playing blackjack and we didn't have an array yet, so we can't shuffle the cards like we should. So we were just picking random cards, and we wanted to say that we didn't want any duplicate cards. And we could ask, we had an if, and we could ask if we had a duplicate card, do it again, draw another card. But it really, we argued, should have been a while, that we keep, while we are picking a card that we've already used, keep picking cards. And so now here is a while loop in this. Okay. So I want to count. I want to count how many rolls it took me to get snake eyes. Please help me. Let something. Okay, where do you want this let? Out of the loop, okay. But it does not have to be outside of the function. Does not have to be outside of the function, but it has to be outside of the loop. So let me just put it here. Let, what do you want to call it? Counter. Do we want to set it equal to something? Yes, no, maybe. Where do you, if you count and you haven't rolled any dice to count, what is your count? 0. So we're either starting at 1 or 0, depending on where we're going to increment. Because we've already rolled the dice once. So it makes sense to call it 1. And then we can increment after we display. Or we could set it equal to 0 and increment before we display. Let's set it equal to 1. No, let's set it equal to 0. And increment before we display. No, I don't like, do I like that? Never mind. I'm going to move this up here because I want it in my display, so I better have it up here. Let the counter equal 1. And then I'm going to add it to my display. Counter plus maybe a dot. Oops. A dot and a space. maybe a tab. So I'm adding my counter here. So I set my counter equal to 1. I roll the random dice. I'm displaying my counter and my dice. And then down here, I should do the same. Increment my counter and add it to the display. So I'm just going to steal this. /T is a tab. So it gives you some space. It gives you a set amount. It sort of makes columns. If the numbers don't get too big, it sort of makes nice columns for you. So if my count gets up, if my count goes from single digits to double digits, the tab, my dice should be lined up. Is the idea of a tab. So let's see if we are counting. So there's my counter, there's the result of my tab, that nice aligning of the columns, even when I get up to 10. And I got up to 23 this time. And then 254. So this thing can vary quite a lot. All right, so this is a while loop. Again, a while loop is when you are repeating. You don't know how many times you're repeating when you start repeating. Different from a for loop. A for loop, at the beginning of the loop, we know how many times we're going to be in. Not necessarily when we start the program, but when you start the loop. We took some text and we divided it up into letters and we showed their ASCII values. That was a for loop. I don't know how many times when I'm writing the program I'm going to be in that loop, but as soon as the person types their message, I can determine how many characters are in there, and then I do the for loop based on how big their message is. So that's a for loop. But this is a while loop because I don't know how many times I'm going to roll the dice until I get a snake eyes. It was just 20 something and now it was 200 something. When I don't know how many times I'm going to be in the loop, that's a while loop. If I wanted to know on average how many times I have to roll the dice to get snake eyes.
All the times and then divided by times.
So I'm going to do it a number of times, and then I am going to keep track of the count each time and add them all up and divide.
One that is sums up all the value of the counter, and another one how many counters, new counters will go down, and then you.
All right. So let's do it. Do we want to do it? Do we want a different button? Have a different button. So this is 1. And now let me put it under here. Let me have a break. Let's have another button. And what are we going to call it? Average or something? I don't know. Get av. How about that? And then we need a place to display that answer. I'll put it in a div. And I'll call that div app. Okay. Let's do that. And let's just put dash 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 in the beginning. Okay. So I have to make get av. So we're getting the average. I'm going to steal a lot of this. Cut out that big, crazy long comment. So here is get average. We said we still want die1, die2 counter. We want something to say how many times we're going to do this, how many times are we going to roll the dice. And then we're going to keep track of the sum of the counts for each of those. So I need a variable name for the number of what we'll call samples. What do you want to call it? Sum is the sum. I want the sample number first. Sample. How many samples do you want to do? 100, thanks. All right, and then let sum. And what do you want sum to be in the beginning? That counter was 1. I'll take that, but I won't take it for sum. Sum starts at 0. All right. So now I want what? One thing is I want a for loop that goes over all the stuff that we've just done to do what we've just done many times. Okay, so we know how to do that. For what do we usually do? Let I equal 1, okay. Semicolon I less than or equal to sample and I plus plus. There's the beginning, and then the answer, the end is way down here. And so all the stuff, all the usual stuff is now in the while loop, and I'm going to format. This format gives me nice indenting, and it gives me a nice test of are things matching up. So here's the beginning of my for loop, and the end of my for loop should match it. Here's my while loop. Here's my function. Okay, so in my loop over the I going up to sample, I am setting my counter equal to 1. Does it make sense for me to set my counter to 1 each time in this loop? Any other answers? Yes, it does make sense. The thing that we want to not be written over is sum. So we're going to counter is counting how many times it took to get snake eyes. So we start, it's the first time we start the count at 1, we roll until we get snake eyes. I did it in 5 rolls. I'm going to add that 5 to my sum. Then I'm going to come back up and go for my second sample. I set my counter back to 1. So then if I rolled snake eyes right away, it would be a 1, not a 6. And then if I add that 1 to my sum, I do want that to be 6. So I need sum to not renew, but counter to renew. All right. So when do I add to sum? When should I'm trying to keep track of how many times it rolled. I rolled so many times to get, how many times it rolled to get snake eyes. I get my snake eyes, and I want to keep track of that in a sum because I want an average. Where do I do that? Where do I add count to sum or counter to sum? Where do I do that? In what?
In the while.
Not in the while loop. But right after the while loop. So I'm in the while loop, I'm rolling, and counting. And then I get, as I said, the first time, the 5, and then I'm ready to add the 5. If I do it in the while loop, my count is 1, then it's 2, then it's 3. And if I keep adding all those things to the sum, I'm going to have a crazy sum. So after the while loop, but inside the for loop, I should add counter to sum. What does the code for adding counter to sum look like? I want to add, I have a sum. First time around it's 0. I rolled the dice. I got snake eyes on the 5th roll. I want to add that 5 to my 0 and make it the new sum. Tell me what line of code to write. Done things like this before. Last week in lab in depreciation, you kept subtracting something and making it the new amount. Adding something and making it the new amount. I have the loops. I just want the single line of code that adds the counter. After I figure out the counter, when I'm done the while loop, I know my counter, and I want to add it to my sum. And I'm looking for the single line of code that will add counter to sum and make it the new sum.
Sum plus equals counter.
Sum plus equal counter. That's the shorthand, or you could say sum equals sum plus counter. But that takes the sum. Presumably it exists, it does, and we set it equal to 0, so it's got a value to start with. Add counter to it, make it the new sum. Now I want to, so my while loop, roll until I get snake eyes. My for loop, run through sample by sample and see how many, and then my while loop tells me how many times it takes to get snake eyes, and I add it to my sum. Now what? I want an average.
Over divided by 1. We have to make another one variable, right?
Possibly. I can make another variable. What do you want the other? I can just slap, I can do some calculation and slap it immediately on the page, or I can give it a name and then do the calculation and then put it on the page. So
just sum divided by counter.
Sum divided by,
No, not counted by.
Sum divided by sample. Sum was I added them all up. Sample was the number of things. So I'm going to I'll make a variable, but it was my sum outside of the for loop. I only do the addition when I'm done all of the adding. So sample with a capital E, there we go. And what do I want to do? I want to display that. Where do I want to display it? In div av. So document get element by ID. Div sum inner HTML because it's a div. Make it av. I could put in lots of more words. I could say the average number of times it takes to roll snake eyes with 100 samples is. I could write all that. I'm tired. I'm just going to write the average. I have a nice number of samples, 100. If I wanted to insist, then it's 2 decimal places, I would say .2 fixed. All right, let's see what happens. There we are. So this we didn't touch. Oh, I got it in 5. That's what I was saying. I got it in 5 rows and I got it in 5 rows. That's amazing. Okay. And then get the average. Came up to be 42 this time. $38, $33. So the average jumps around. If you want it to not jump around as much, what would you do? Have a bigger sample size. If you have a bigger population, then it's going to be more accurate. The average will be more accurate. And what is the answer? Let's do the experiment. Instead of 100, where is that? Oh, it's in the other function. There it is. What do you want me to do instead of 100? 10,000. It's taking longer because it's 10,000. And there's also a while loop. Sometimes it takes a while. Maybe 10,000 was too many. It was. Yeah, I might have to go down to 1,000. Yeah. But this is taking too long for me. Let's go down to 1,000. Is that's 1,000 is taking too long. There it is, 37. So I still didn't get to 36, which is the answer. Okay. All right, so that is, if I put one loop inside another, do you know a word for that? What was the word we used when we put one if inside another? Nesting. So if you put a loop, if you put an if inside an if, it's a nested if. If you put a loop inside a loop, it's a nested loop. What's a nested loop? Will I put a nested loop on test 2? You know, no. It's enough. Okay. And it's usually a for loop. Anything that you can do with a for, you can do with a while. Anything you do with a while, you can do with a for. But I usually like for loops. Okay. While we're playing dice, we're playing blackjack, and then we're playing dice. Let's play some more dice. I'm going to use this file that has images of dice. I'm going to download that. Going to extract that. Okay, now I have a folder with dice in it. I don't think I already have a folder with dice in it. No, I have cards in Magritte. So I'm going to take that folder with dice. It's in downloads. I'm going to put it in my 230. And there it is. Okay. So I'm going to make, so now I have some dice images. So I'm going to roll a die and display the image. Okay, so I'm going to make a new page. Doing here, new page plus roll dice, and I want to eventually want a timer. So I'll call roll dice timer.html and my exclamation point. And I'll say roll dice timer. And I'll have a header. And it will say roll dice timer. Okay. And I'm going to have an image and I'm going to have a button. So the button will make the image change to a new dice. So let me have the image and then so I want an image, IMG. I want to give it an ID so I can code it. Image die, maybe I'll call it die 1. Maybe someday there'll be a second die. And what? I'll give it an SRC. And the die images are in the folder called dice, and then they're die1.gif. So I'll put the first die in there. So it'll be dice / dice is the folder, and then die1, and then it is a GIF. And then I'm going to have a break, and then I'll have a button underneath. And the button's going to say roll. And it's going to have an on click. And it's going to call roll. And then we need a script area. And I need a function called roll. And what am I going to do? I'm going to sneak over to here to dice and cheat. There it is. I have I'll let die 1, and die 1 is math floor, math random 6 + 1. We've played this game before. If you like parseInt instead of math floor, feel free. Then what are we going to do? We're going to change the image of the source image. So that is document get element by ID. what did I call it? Image die, img die 1. What property are we going to change? The picture. So the SRC. What's it going to be? It's going to be like this, except I want to make the 1 a variable. Okay. Now there's something called a template literal, which is a different way than what I'm going to do right now. But what I want to do is if I have something and I want to have a part of it that changes and a part of it that doesn't change, then I'll end the quote and say plus, and then plus, and go back into the quote. So those are the two parts that don't change, and I want to replace 1 with die 1. So I have an image, I have a button, I have a function, I'm getting a random number between 1 and 6, and I'm using that number to change the image. Let's see if that works. So here is my die image, here's my roll button. And sometimes I click the button and it doesn't change. Because there's a random number between 1 and 6, and it's possible 1/6 of the time on average that you'll get the same value again. So it seems like it's not working sometimes. I don't want it to seem like it's not working sometimes. So this way I'm going to now introduce a timer, and I'm going to roll it many times. So I'm going to call this what? Call this start timer. And I'm going to make a function now. I could spell function start timer. And I'm going to have a timer. This is a different version of repetition. Instead of a for loop, I'm going to have a timer keep calling the function roll. And so I'm going to say timers have an ID. So I'm going to say there's a timer ID out here. And then I'm going to say timer ID is equal to set interval . It's going to call roll. How frequently do you want it to call roll? How many milliseconds between one and the next one? 1,000 milliseconds would be once a second. So this is going to be slow, and we'll be able to see it happen, and then we'll speed it up. So right now, this function, so the button calls start timer starts a timer. That's why we called it start timer. And start timer is going to call roll at once a second, every 1,000 milliseconds. Where are we at? It's changing. If I speed it up, if I take that number down, it's going to happen more often. What's my problem? Doesn't stop.
Yeah.
I needed to stop. Okay. So there are two ways, at least two, there are probably many ways to make it stop. One way to make it stop, there's something called clear interval, which stops the interval. You can sort of decide you're going to count how many times it rolls. And then when you hit a certain number, then call the clear interval. So that's one way. The other way is to have another timer, which is a timer that just goes off once. And when that timer goes off, it's once, it will stop the other timer. You want to just count, or do you want the other to see the other kind of timer? What do you want? What? Count. Okay. So we're going to count. So I need, what did you like to call it? Counter. I'm going to start it at, I don't know, 0. No, let's do this. Let's start it in here, counter. Let's start it there at 0. And in roll, we're going to increment our counter. And then we want to stop our timer if the counter gets so big. If counter, do you want to say equal, do you want to say greater than? What do you want to do? Equal. And how many do you want? How many rolls before we stop it?
100.
He's got it at once a second. I'm not going to wait 100 seconds. Too impatient for that. So when the count gets to 10, we want to stop the timer. That is called clear interval. And you need the timer ID. So now it should go like 10 or maybe 11 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It stopped. Okay. So we've stopped the timer. I'm not time for the most part. What happens if you click the button twice? I hope not. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you roll the same thing twice, if you roll the same number twice, it seems to lag. There's 20 seconds gone by. It's not stopped. I had a timer ID. I clicked the timer. I had a timer ID. I started a second timer. I overwrote and got a new timer ID. And then I used the timer ID to stop the timer. But I stopped the second timer, the first timer still going. So it does slow down at some point, because at one point there are 2 timers. And now there's only 1 timer. But I've only stopped one of the timers. The easy fix is to disable the button until the timer is done rolling, and then re-enable the timer. Just prevent them from clicking it twice. That's the easiest solution. But I am out of time. I'll stop recording. I will hang around to answer questions.